Welcome back to ONC on Ground News Channel, and today we'll be talking about the Tigrayan War and live updates as we see. So far today, there has been fighting around Nefas Machao and the surrounding regions around the B-22 highway surrounding Debre Zabit, as Ethiopian forces were able to regain most of the lost towns around the B-22 highway where the offensive from Geshena was able to cut off Tigrayan Defense Forces who were pushing all the way to Debre Tabor and sieging it. In the past 2 days or 3 days, Debre Tabor or surrounding areas such as Nefas, Machao, um, Gasai, I think that's how you say it, and also Gaint, which was able to be liberated after um, most of um, the Grand Defense Forces were just retreating because of the offensive at Kashena and how their supplies were cut off mostly, and also a counteroffensive from um, Gondor and forces from Deretab were able to push back the TDF. Other reporting fightings are around um, Wildia and Mursa around this area. As we can see here, where around Mursa and north of Mursa, there has been fighting with Ethiopian National Defense Forces (ENDF) and TDF contesting Mursa and the surrounding areas. Um, so far, uh, the TDF are on the retreat on the western front, um, but are still counterattacking the offensive in Gashena, where there's still most of the reinforcements are coming through here. So you can definitely see in the next 2 days offensives and heavy fighting around these few towns where the counter offensive and also the Debre Tabor offensive are going to clash again around Geshena, around these towns where you're more likely to see fighting. Debre Zabit and Filakit are also cut off from the B-22 highway, which means any supplies or any road connecting these highways are mostly cut off since it is mostly mountainous. You can see here how mountainous it is around here, which you can like really see how mountain most of the surrounding areas are, and having these roads or using these roads are really essential and having a long campaign to take some land in Amara region. So with the loss of Gashena um, here, the TDF are not able to effectively supply the offensive in near Debre Tabor, which resulted in most of TDF forces retreating because of, I would say, it's just a tactical retreat and it's basically half and half where most towns were there are reports of TPLF fighters just abandoning the towns, where others where near Gashena, for example, where there were heavy fights. Um, Currently, they're still fighting at Gashena. You can assume that more more soldiers are coming through the B-22 highway to retake Gashena and continue the offensive. Because of the loss of Gashena, most of the offensive is just crumbling down. Um, the next offensive, I would say, should be coming from the north, where most of the northern area around Welgite and in this area is pretty remote. It's also really hard to traverse since it is part of the Simien Mountains, where one of the highest mountains in Ethiopia, Resh Dashen, and surrounding areas are really mountainous, which makes any warfare really difficult and slow. So you might be able to see some gains or some losses around this area, but you won't be seeing any um, contested areas like this section of the highway in this area compared to this area where it's pretty mountainous, hard to traverse even compared to this area which is even as similarly mountainous. Um, there have been a push to take this monastery, as you can see here. This was captured on the 29th of July, which kind of marks the offensive that the TDF did take and pushed back in Raya and captured Afar around the beginning of August. And since then, TDF have been able to capture Sakota, surrounding regions, such as crossing around the Tegese River, taking the reservoir and the dam in Tegese. And they have also been able to gain this zone from a defector from the Afar Special Forces. So the TDF are expanding on both sides, as you can see, um, pushing into Lalibela, taking Sakota, which is with the help of the ALF, Go Liberation Front, I think. They are able to push more westward, but you would most of the strategy in taking land is following these highways, following the main roads, and besieging towns, and really avoiding any urban warfare and more of a waiting game, as you can see in Waldea, where most of the fighting was done around the city, and which with like a week or 5 days, the city fell because of the heavy barrages and the influx of soldiers slowly pushing into the city. So, other fights have been reported in Afar, where Jerfa, which was a contested town, Jerfa was a contested town around a week ago. Now is um, firmly in the NDF hands. Same thing with surrounding areas in Wolo on the east side of this A2 highway, where most of the fighting is happening across this highway, as you can see in this orange, which is the contested areas where TDF and ENDF plus our regional forces are contesting at the moment. You can see Kobo, which is really close to areas of contest, which you can assume where most of the offensive is happening in the southern half or this eastern half of the highway, where Ethiopian forces are reported to have heavy fighting around this area in Afar. There have also been reports of um, Turkish drones being sent to Ethiopia, which the Turkish embassy has denied. So this war has been expanding. Um, Eritrean forces are mostly out of Ethiopia and are not continuing their offensive into Tigray, which basically makes reduces the war fronts to basically the western part along the B22 highway and also the A2 highway in the east areas, Afar and Wola, near Kobo and also near Marsa. So these areas are contested and also are in heavy fighting, and also in Marsa, in the north of Marsa, and also in uh, this this area of the A2 highway. Um, with the tactics that the Ethiopian forces are doing, they are waiting, or I would say they're not really waiting, but the TDF did stretch way too far, as you can see in this offensive, that they did push all the way to Debre Tabor using this B22 highway, and because they pushed way too quickly and way too deep into enemy territory, they were easily cut off from their supply uh, chain from the B-22 highway through the Geshena push. So you can see, I would say, from now on, a slower effort, I would say, and not more of a quick town pushes from the TDF because of their inability to keep up with the or protecting their this really thin territory that they took. Um, with the Ethiopian strategy, you would probably see a more active push to take highways, especially this highway, which can completely cut off uh, the Weldia um, push in the offensive in Weldia. So if the Ethiopian forces were able to push into this A2 highway and capture these areas, um, most of the offensive in this part of the region basically without any supplies or any or the supplies are going to be taking much longer than this major highway, which is a much easier way to transport troops and supplies. Um, this road also, you can see that they have pushed more into rural areas, whereas before rural areas are mostly just abandoned, like not really contested. So most of the eastern or western sides of the border has been captured, especially in Sakota. Most of this area has been captured, but it would most likely be in the hands of TDF since most of the fighting are currently in here and over here. Um, Other reports are these are pictures of Ethiopian National Defense Force army pushing into Geshena, Kasai, and also in Nefas Majau. Pictures like this shows the TDF tank that was recently destroyed in fighting around Nefas Majau. And same as this photo shows, I really don't remember the town, but it shows the victories that have been really on the NDF side compared to 1 week ago, where most of these towns were completely abandoned, or where most of these towns were just evacuated or completely abandoned as TPL forces were moving along these highways. Most of the people were reported leaving Nefes Machao, Debrezevit, and also in Khmer Dengai, which is around here. So these towns, people would usually leave or abandon their homes to closer areas where the NDF and RF are more in control of. So most of these towns are not as easily or barely defended as TPLF were moving down a week ago. Um, so you can probably see the same thing if they did manage to push from Mersa and south, where most of these towns, if it's not a prominent town or if it's just a medium-sized town, most inhabitants would move south, as you have reports of internally displaced people, usually in Desi, moving south from Wolo, especially those who lived around Kobo and Weldia, moving south to Desi. There have been reports of people living in Desi or um, people moving to Desi to avoid wars, and most of Tigray now is under control, and I wouldn't be seeing a push into Wakite anytime soon. Other than this push, which is mostly symbolical since this isn't a massive town. So TDF are focusing their time and resources in trying to capture these major towns, major areas in Amara, especially targeting the western areas as in Gondar and Baradar. Um, most of their offensive, I would say, has been halted around this area since this has been the long-lasting front lines in the war in the past 2 weeks. They haven't been able to move past Mersa, and I would say most of the Ethiopian forces are targeting this area and trying to push back. So unless they have a breakthrough on each side, this is still contested, especially in Afar and around Kobo, and also around these towns where most um, there have been reports, satellite images of towns being raised in Habru, where towns have been, or not Habru, yeah, around, um, let me make this straight, around Habru right here, around this town right here, which has been satellite images of most of these villages being burned to the ground, and also images surfacing of towns being razed in Agmasa. You can probably indicate that most of the fighting around here, because of these towns and the fire that have been reported around these regions, so you can kind of get an indication of the front lines because of those reports. Other than that, on Tuesday, there hasn't been any more updates other than the offensive in Debre Tabor being pushed back and heavy fighting around Mursa, which is a new front line, I would say, since yesterday, where there has been a push from TDF and also ENDF around Mursa and the surrounding region. You can see in this image the, the TDF and ENDF are still contesting this area. So other than that, um, it's sort of a stalemate on this front. On this front, there hasn't been any effort on both sides to push back or front. There might be any artillery fire in Debrak or surrounding areas, but other than that, um, I'm I'm confident that TDF won't try to take Wilkite since it's just too much. It's way too rural and less significant than pushing into a Amara region and trying to, or hopefully, trying to take Addis Ababa. This has been your update for Tuesday. Um, Currently still sort of a stalemate. People are saying, or reports have been saying that Endeavor's a beat there's been fighting. So in next couple of days, um, we would expect Debre and Falki to be liberated and taken back. So these areas are still controlled by TDF, but it's still cut off. So unless TDF forces take back Ashina, this area is still cut off and more likely to fall. So other than that, um, it's still somewhat similar or the same front lines in the Wollo area or the Warlo front lines. Um, for the OLA, there has been reports of some smaller towns being taken. Um, since most of OLA operates in rural areas, and since their army size is usually smaller, like around 4,000, most of the controlled areas are rural, um, which kind of gets context of how the war is going on in the south, where most of the major cities and areas in Harage, RC, Shawa, and also in this area has been solidly, and Jimma as well, has been solidly controlled by Ethiopian National Forces, where in Walaka and especially in West Walaka, where there has been less developed areas in rural areas where Olaf have been operating. So there hasn't been many updates in Oromia since it's less the war is a smaller scale compared to the war in the north. Um, but we might be seeing more towns falling, especially in Gimbi, where most of the areas are still being contested, and also in Bulahura, where Bulahura is being sieged by the Ole forces. Um, this was your update for Tuesday, and we will be back tomorrow on Wednesday for a new update.